Hello Sixers, it's time for our next lesson on war poetry. Today is Thursday the 25th of February and we are going to use poetry features today. So this was the starter task in the previous video lesson. We're going to have another go at it now. See if you can do it faster and more accurately than last time. Now you're going to need to pause the video, see if you can match the poetry features to the explanation on the right. Pause the video now. Did you do it successfully? Let's see. There's the answers again there. Now we did say in the last lesson there were certain ones that we're going to focus on today. We'll have a look at those in more detail now. Okay, so here are the 5 different features we're going to cover today. In the tasks, have a look at those on Teams for more details, but we'll go through them a little bit later in the video. Onomatopoeia, good word to spell that. Words that sound like the sound they make, such as bang or pop. Alliteration, repetition of the sound at the start of the words. Similes, describing something as like or as something else. Personification, making things sound alive that aren't. And rhyme as well, we're going to look at that finally. But we're going to focus on some of the descriptive techniques more so. Okay, first thing we'd like to do is just to have a look over some of the poems that we have considered this week. Now, these were 3 in particular that people have asked me to discuss in a bit more detail. I'd like to start with the one on the right, High Flight. Now, the author of this poem was actually a teenage pilot who was in the Canadian Air Force, who was flying a Spitfire plane. You may have heard of the Spitfire planes, the RAF used in World War II, the fighter planes. And this poem was written about his experience of flying the Spitfire, so in the training flights. He was actually killed quite soon after writing this poem, very sadly. Wasn't shot down by the Germans or the other enemy aircraft. He was actually killed in an accident where another aircraft collided with his plane, and he died in the accident. And the other poem on the bottom left there, The Happy Smuggler, this was written from the perspective of a Jewish child, so from one of the ghettos where the Nazis had rounded up the Jewish people and made them live in a certain part of town. It was hemmed in by walls and guard posts, and this was the story of some of the children who, because their families were starving, they used to sneak out, as it says, over the walls, through the holes, and try and evade the guards and bring back food for their families, because they were surviving on as little as 200 calories a day, which is absolutely nothing compared to what we would normally eat each day. You're talking less than a sandwich that each person would be surviving on each day. It's a really interesting one because it's from the perspective of those children. And Back, a poem by Wilfred Gibson, who had fought in World War I, and this is about his trying to readjust to society when he came back, and trying to piece together how he had acted in the way he had when he'd been fighting. He'd done things that he never thought himself capable of. He'd killed, he'd done terrible deeds. It says there, "What can I reply? Who know it wasn't I, but someone just like me." It was as if it was a separate person who had done these things, and he couldn't quite come to terms with it when he returned. There's another poem I'd like to introduce you to, which is called The Sentry. It's by a very famous poet, Wilfred Owen, who had fought in World War I. You may have come across some of his other poems if you were doing one of the challenges where you're researching some of the other war poets. Now this is attached to Teams, this document, and I'd like you to pause the video at this point and see if you can go through and identify. You can do it with colour, put a different colour in each of those boxes at the bottom here, and can you identify where Wilfred Owen has used the senses to describe the battle. Okay, so highlighting different colours which senses are being used and whereabouts in the poem. You have to pause the video now. I've also highlighted a few keywords and phrases here that might help you understand the poem a little bit better. So if you look at the first one in the first line, we found an old Boche dugout. The dugout of the enemy, the Germans. So the Boche is one of the nicknames used for the German soldiers in World War One. And the dugout sort of, well, literally, the earth was dug out and made into a sort of shelter or a barricade from where they could fire on the enemy. Next one, whiz bangs, good example of onomatopoeia. That was actually the sound that the explosives made as they whizzed through the air and then banged when they exploded. So those shells that were fired. The sentry was like a watchman who'd be watching for the enemy movements to alert his fellow soldiers to what was happening. Coaxing was encouraging or soothing someone, so coaxing trying to soothe the injured sentry. And that final one, crumps, which you hopefully remember from the previous lesson, which was a word that was used to describe the sound as the shells hit the earth and exploded. Crump, another example of onomatopoeia. So you've had time then to go through that poem and identify some examples of the senses being used to describe the battle. So I've highlighted a few examples here. Some of them will cross over into different senses as well. If you see in this stanza here, what murk of air remained, stank old and sour. That could be both smell and taste. Sight is obviously one of the most common things. We could have highlighted lots in there. Also things for feeling is really important. You could actually feel the crumps pummeling the roof of where they were. You could feel it shaking the roof. The wind buffeting, or the wind, the air from the explosion buffeting them, so actually moving them, the air moving them backwards or taking their breath away. Things you could hear, people whining, shouting, onomatopoeia, thud, flump, thud, the hammering of the shells on top. Okay, so all things you could hear throughout. The shrieking air is another good example. Okay. So what you can do as well, if you want further examples to help you with the first task, which we're going to look at now, you can look back through the other poems that we considered earlier in the week, or other poems that you found, and see if you can find more examples of the poets using the 5 senses to help with their descriptions. The task A then on all of the assignment documents for different groups is to complete a senses mind map. Okay, so a mind map will look something like this. Now, depending on what your poem is going to be about, that is what will go in the centre here of the mind map. So for example, if we were to do a mind map about the battle, perhaps a popular choice, gives you lots of things that you can discuss, and also we've got lots of good examples from the previous poems, descriptions of the battle. Okay, and then you can start to add perhaps some of your own ideas, what you could see, hear, smell, taste or feel, or as I said, you can magpie some ideas from the other poems. So think about if you were in the battle, and if you look on the YouTube, on the Teams assignment, there's some YouTube links as well that may give you some food for thought. So if you watch those clips, if you're a bit stuck, they might help. And here's a couple of ideas that might get you started as well. So things that you could smell, could be the smoke from the explosions, could be burning buildings or other things around you, could have been set alight in the battle. Gas, if gas has been sent over into the trench, that was a common tactic used in the war, where enemy soldiers would fire gas shells at the enemy. Could be bodies as well. If it was a hot day, you could have the smell of the corpses drifting in off the battlefield over in no man's land. What could you hear? Well, you could hear the guns reverberating, firing all around. It could be soldiers shouting, screaming, shrieking. Or it could be almost after an explosion and your hearing has gone funny. You could just be able to hear your own heartbeat beating in your chest. So lots of different ideas. See what you can come up with for your mind map. So that's task A. Task B, use the ideas from your mind map to write your own examples of similes and alliteration. That's for green group. Blue group, similes, alliteration and onomatopoeia. And orange or yellow group, use the ideas from your mind map to write your own examples of similes, alliteration, onomatopoeia and personification. Now it says with all of them, refer to the examples and the video. Obviously you're watching the video lesson now, but there's things to help you. And beneath the task, there are these examples included, and they're being colour coded so you know which is which. Now the challenge then afterwards is to use your work from task B to create some rhyming couplets. Remember that was one of the features that we said we would look at, lines that rhyme. So we've got an example here, the machine gun rattled like a drum, the last thing ever heard by some. We've got this other example here, the icy gusts bit at our skin and seemed to freeze the bones within. Okay, so challenge yourself at the end there to come up with your own rhyming couplets. Final assignment for the week is going to be to write your own poem. So the more you do today, the easier you will find it tomorrow. Okay, that's it for me for today. Looking forward to seeing your work on Teams as ever. Bye for now.